Pennsylvania operated Eastern State Penitentiary from its opening in 1829 until the year before its abandonment in 1971. By the time Eastern closed, prisons had become the standard response to crime in American society. But in the first decades of the 19th century, prisons were still experimental, and Eastern's system of separate confinement represented one of the most controversial and expensive social experiments of its day. Eastern's distinctive system initially set it apart from other prisons. Nevertheless, its story is a tale of the nation's changing ideas about crime and punishment. Contemporary debates about the prison system echo with the hopes and frustrations that punctuated Eastern's history. Before the introduction of prisons, colonists equated crime with sin. Sinful impulses were an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of man's fallen nature. Crime might be deterred through fear of God's wrath or man's, but whether deterred or not, crime had to be punished. In addition to the widespread use of fines, punishments included public humiliation in the stocks or pillory, flogging, branding, and banishment. For many offenses, including repeated convictions for stealing, the penalty was death on the gallows. Local jails were found throughout the colonies, but time in jail was not seen as a punishment in itself. No one expected that time in jail would either deter or reform criminals. Jails held people awaiting trial or sentencing, or they held debtors until they could make good on their debts. Inmates were usually indiscriminately mixed, often crowded together: male, female, young, old, felon, debtor. The colonial system of punishments depended upon social and geographic stability. Personal ties of family, church, and community enforced standards of conduct. Formal and informal sanctions promoted sober, obedient, God-fearing behavior and punished deviance and depravity. The idea of using imprisonment as a form of punishment grew out of a new conception of the world formed in 18th century Europe by the political philosophers of the Enlightenment. Their utilitarian theory saw humans as free and autonomous beings governed by reason. The problem of crime came not from the evil nature of man, from original sin, but from the cruel use of power by the state. The Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria captured this thinking in his influential treatise on crimes and punishments. Many Enlightenment thinkers believed that a properly conceived, rational, and humane criminal code could deter crime. As champions of individual rights and liberties, those thinkers argued that any punishment exceeding the minimum penalty necessary to preserve order was abuse and not justice. American civic leaders in the 1790s saw their new republic as a land where ideas could be tried, a new social order crafted. Committees in various states called for legislative reforms that could enact the utilitarian principles and humane practices discussed in Europe. As early as 1787, an organization that was to become the Pennsylvania Prison Society began to advocate the humane treatment and reform of convicts. Influenced by the writings of the English prison reformer John Howard, their efforts led to major changes in Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail, eventually the nation's first state prison. Those changes included the separation of debtors from felons, the introduction of new rules governing the conduct of inmates, and the construction of cells for the solitary imprisonment of serious criminals. In the next few years, most states abolished the death penalty for all but the most serious crimes, built new prisons or converted former facilities, and began sentencing felons to terms of incarceration. Despite the optimism that inspired those reforms, early prisons, which were little more than holding pens, quickly became crowded with repeat offenders.
It was not unusual, we are told, for 16 convicts to be locked up together by themselves in one cell for the night, with lights, cards, musical instruments, and a supply of intoxicating liquors. In these committee rooms of Satan, the vilest schemes of profligacy were devised and the grossest acts of depravity perpetrated, while confederacies and combinations were formed by the practiced veteran with the novice in crime, Frederick Adolphus Packard.
Nowhere was this system of imprisonment crowned with the hoped-for success. Every year, the legislature of each state voted considerable funds toward the support of the penitentiaries, and the continued return of the same individuals into the prisons proved the inefficiency of the system. However, instead of accusing the theory itself, its execution was attacked. It was believed that the whole evil resulted from a lack of cells and the crowding of prisoners. Alexis de Tocqueville, 1833.
Problems of crime and disorder alarmed many in the new republic. Political and economic changes were disrupting previous social arrangements, weakening the relationships that had defined and maintained an orderly society. Growing numbers of landless, unskilled, and unapprenticed people, both immigrant and native-born, traveled the countryside and congregated in newly emerging cities. Between 1790 and 1830, the population of Pennsylvania tripled. Civic leaders became increasingly concerned about the undisciplined, immoral, and illegal conduct of these lower classes. Establishing social order among the poor was a prevailing concern.
Our newspapers teem with relations of crimes of every dye. Our cities, villages, and factories are frequently in flames. Felonies that affect the stability of our moneyed institutions are becoming common. A government which fails to repress such a course of criminality fails also in its highest duty, that of protection. Samuel Hopkins, 1822.
Reformers sought to apply the newly adopted rational principles to the design and management of penitentiaries themselves, and to build other institutions, asylums, hospitals, and orphanages, to instill the values of hard work, regimentation, humility, and sobriety. The very architecture and routines of prison life were employed to discipline as well as punish convicts. World attention would focus on two competing plans for imprisonment devised in the 1820s: New York's silent system and Pennsylvania's separate system of prison discipline. New York State authorized the construction of Auburn Prison in 1816. Auburn introduced a congregate form of prison discipline that, through the use of brutal floggings, prohibited all communication between convicts, even as it required them to work side by side throughout the day. That system became known as the silent system.
At Auburn, we have a more beautiful example of what may be done by proper discipline in a prison well constructed. The whole establishment from the gate to the sewer is a specimen of neatness. The unremitted industry, the entire subordination and subdued feeling of the convicts has no parallel. In their solitary cells they spend the night with no other book but the Bible, and at sunrise they proceed in military order under the eye of the turnkeys in solid columns with the lock march to their workshops, thence in the same order at the hour of breakfast to the common hall, where they partake of their wholesome and frugal meal in silence. Not even a whisper is heard, the bold staring of the prisoners, which indicates an unsubdued and audacious spirit in the culprits. This is never seen at Auburn. The Boston Prison Discipline Society, 1826.
The silent system imposed an impressive discipline among convicts, but at a cost. Auburn's administrators and admirers abandoned the humanitarian ideals that had played such an important role in the introduction of prisons, and they abandoned hope and responsibility for reforming criminals. The Pennsylvania Prison Society in Philadelphia, an organization strongly influenced by its Quaker members, was not willing to give up on either of those ideals. The Prison Society explicitly rejected the brutality needed to maintain the Auburn system and advocated in its place a system of confinement that would lead to the reformation of criminals. At the Prison Society's urging, Pennsylvania allocated funds for the construction of Eastern State Penitentiary in 1821, and the prison opened in 1829. The design of Eastern State embodied Quaker ideas about the nature of man and the redemptive powers of solitary reflection and penitence. The founders of Eastern selected a plan that enabled convicts to work in the isolation of their cells. Complete isolation, relieved by the discipline of work, would allow convicts to seek the light of God, which Quakers saw as the path to reformation.
Absolute solitude for years without labor or moral or religious instruction probably does bear too severely upon a social being like man. But this mode of punishment, weighing as it does upon the hardened and impenitent felon, is eminently calculated to break down his obdurate spirit. When that important object of penitentiary discipline has been gained, he learns and he feels that moral and religious reflection, relieved by industrious occupation at his trade, comfort and support his mental and physical powers, divest his solitary cell of all its horrors, and his punishment of much of its severity. Charles S. Cox, 1830.
The philosophy guiding Eastern presented many challenges for the architect. The building had to prevent communication between inmates in order to maintain total isolation and silence. Each cell had to accommodate both the prisoner and his or her work equipment. In addition, each cell had to be equipped with water, rudimentary plumbing, and heat. Prevailing theory held that prisons needed adequate ventilation to prevent jail fever, which had plagued earlier institutions, and the planners wanted an imposing building that would inspire fear and respect among the citizenry.
Let the avenue to this house be rendered difficult and gloomy by mountains or morasses. Let its doors be of iron. Let the grating occasioned by the opening and shutting of them be increased by an echo that shall deeply pierce the soul. Benjamin Rush.
In attempting to unite convenience, strength, and economy with other desired objects in this prison, I have maturely studied various geometrical figures, but could not find any so advantageous for the accomplishment of those properties as the one I have adopted. It appears to me to be a form best calculated for watching, convenience, economy, and ventilation. John Haviland.
John Haviland's original plan called for 250 cells, each with its own exercise yard, arranged in 7 single-story wings. The centrally placed guard and the design accommodating surveillance reveal the influence of the ideas of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham had extended utilitarian principles to the design of a model prison, which he called the panopticon. In his plan, prisoners never knew when they were being watched. Guards hidden from the prisoner's view could see into any cell from the central observatory. Haviland's plan for Eastern also emphasized watching, but it was the empty spaces between cells that guards could see from the rotunda. To overhear and stop forbidden communication between convicts, guards patrolled the corridors with stockings covering their shoes. Prisoners occupied the first cell block of Eastern State in 1829, even as construction was still underway. Population pressures were heavy from the start. Before the work crews had finished blocks 2 and 3, prison officials realized that the original plan would not house a sufficient number of convicts. Haviland had to redesign the remaining 4 blocks as 2-story structures. The new plans accommodated 450 prisoners in separate cells. Another major design change made during construction involved the addition of interior cell doors. The first 3 cell blocks allowed entrance to each cell only through its exercise yard. Inside walls lacked doors and had only small feeding windows to permit guards to pass convicts their meals. But that design proved inconvenient and inefficient for both the guards taking convicts to and from their cells and the prison chaplain, making rounds to offer religious instruction. Haviland's cell blocks were built on 10 acres of a former cherry orchard outside Philadelphia, and many people refer to it as the Cherry Hill Prison. An imposing 30-foot stone wall enclosed the entire site. Since the design called for all prisoners to remain within their cells for the whole of their terms, the wall, with its corner towers and Gothic style, was intended as much to intimidate citizens as to contain the inmates. Both men and women served time at Eastern, though the number of female convicts rarely exceeded 8 or 10% of the prison's total population. In the early years, a typical sentence was for 2 or 3 years. Few inmates served terms of more than 14 years, though the sentences were longer in the latter part of the prison's history. At committal, a convict was interviewed, given prison clothes, and taken to his or her cell. For that passage through the prison, a hood was placed over the prisoner's head to keep any but the guards and keepers from knowing the convict's identity. There, in a space of 12 by 7.5 feet, under a vaulted ceiling designed to echo even the slightest sounds, the convict would stay for the whole of his or her sentence, alone except for the occasional visit from a guard, the chaplain, a member of the prison society, or perhaps a dignitary touring the prison. Inmates at Eastern State were permitted no contact with family or friends, no news of events outside the prison, and each was allowed a mere hour a day of solitary outdoor exercise, a period frequently shortened in practice. Prisoners were required to remain silent and suffered additional punishment if anger, disobedience, or insanity compelled them to communicate with neighboring prisoners or to rant to themselves or the devils of their imaginations. Their work involved crafts such as shoemaking or weaving. Or if a prisoner had experience in the building trades, he was employed alongside paid laborers in the construction of the remaining cell blocks of the prison. Problems with the heating and ventilation meant the cells were often unhealthily damp and cold, or stifling hot. The design of the plumbing system, which called for twice-weekly flushing, often left waste in the pipes, forcing prisoners to breathe tainted air. And yet, for all its faults, Eastern State was an architectural marvel of its day. It was the most expensive public building yet constructed in the United States, and it was the first building to attempt such elaborate large-scale heating and plumbing systems. The penitentiary attracted many visitors who toured the institution, investigating the design of its cells and the engineering of its systems. At first, only 100 or so came each year, but the numbers of curious grew. In 1836, more than 2,000 people toured Eastern's corridors and grounds, 4,000 in 1839, 10,000 in 1858. Among those signing the visitors' book were dignitaries from around the nation and around the world, statesmen, noblemen, scholars. They came to see a novel experiment in criminal justice, an architectural embodiment of Enlightenment philosophy, reconciled to Quaker theology. The majority of visitors applauded the prison, and its radial design became the model for new prisons around the world. But Eastern's separate system was not without its critics. The humanitarian ideals of the separate system were difficult to implement in practice. Problems with discipline and abuses of power corrupted the system from its start. Proponents of New York's more militaristic Auburn system pointed to the unprecedented expense of Eastern's construction and charged that its system of solitary labor was unproductive and unprofitable. They argued that inmates learned no discipline alone in their cells, where they did not face the hardship of working silently alongside other convicts under the supervision of guards. Despite its claims of conducting a noble experiment, unsullied by base concerns for money and humane in its treatment of inmates, just 5 years after its opening, the state had to investigate charges of abuse of prisoners, misuse and embezzlement of funds, and immoral practices of officers and agents of the prison. Testimony revealed that prisoners were allowed out of their cells to wait on the administrative staff or to do work that earned money for officers. Lax enforcement of rules for silence and isolation continued throughout the 1840s and 50s, and included the practice of pairing prisoners to work together to learn a craft or trade. The 1834 investigators also uncovered the use of severe and abusive punishments against prisoners. One boy, Charles Warwick, sentenced at age 16 to 5 years for arson, was severely punished for cutting shoe leather.
He was kept in the dark punishment cell for 42 days. On the evening of that day, one of the keepers was attracted to the cell of this miserable wretch by repeated knockings. On looking in at the cell, the convict exhibited every symptom of delirium produced by starvation. He was on his knees, his eyes rolling in frenzy, and his frame reduced to a skeleton.
Another boy, Seneca Plumley, who entered the prison at age 19 for horse stealing, was subjected to a water bath, which involved pouring buckets of cold water over a prisoner from a great height. The investigation found that the weather was extremely cold. He was in a state of nudity, and icicles formed on his hair, and his person was encrusted with ice. Most notorious was the use of the iron gag, used to punish prisoners caught talking to others.
This was a rough iron instrument resembling the stiff bit of a blind bridle, with chains at each end to pass around the neck and fasten behind. This instrument was placed in the prisoner's mouth, the chains brought round the jaws to the back of the neck, drawn tight to the fourth link, and fastened with a lock. His hands were then forced into leather gloves and crossed behind his back. The straps were drawn tight, the hands forced up toward the head, creating pressure on the jaws and jugular vein, producing excruciating pain and a hazardous effusion of blood to the head. The McKelway Report, 1835.
On June 27, 1833, Matthew Macumsey died while fastened in that device. The investigation of 1834 also offered the first evidence that the prisoners found ways to communicate with each other through notes and rapping on the pipes, and that the officers permitted prisoners to leave their cells unmasked to work on tasks within the prison. While some critics focused on the laxness of rules at Eastern, others pointed to the dangers associated with strict adherence to those rules.
In the outskirts of Philadelphia stands a great prison called the Eastern Penitentiary, conducted on a plan peculiar to the state of Pennsylvania. The system here is rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement. I believe it, in its effects, to be cruel and wrong. In its intentions, I am well convinced that it is kind, humane, and meant for reformation, but I am persuaded that those who devised this system of prison discipline, and those benevolent gentlemen who carry it into execution, do not know what it is they are doing. I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony which this dreadful punishment, prolonged for years, inflicts upon the sufferers. Standing at the central point and looking down these dreary passages, the dull repose and quiet that prevails is awful. Occasionally there is a drowsy sound from some lone weaver's shuttle or shoemaker's last, but it is stifled by the thick walls and heavy dungeon doors, and only serves to make the general stillness more profound. The prisoner is a man buried alive, to be dug out in the slow round of years. Charles Dickens, 1842.
Eastern survived investigations and criticisms of its practices, continually defending its philosophy, even though the convicts it released showed no more signs of reformation than those held in other prisons. However, the 1840s were the beginning of the Industrial Age in America, and the changes that came with industrialization eventually made it impractical for the separate system to continue. The majority of men and women who served time at Eastern were sentenced for property crimes and came from the lower economic classes. Most were convicted for larceny, followed by burglary, horse stealing, forgery, and robbery. As the debates of the early 19th century made clear, the invention of penitentiaries represented both optimism about the possibilities of social engineering and profound anxiety about the emerging lower classes. That anxiety about the poor proved an enduring motivation for the reform and expansion of the prison system. From the start, fear of the poor was mixed with a contempt for people of color, a contempt that grew as the number of dislocated blacks increased. But it must be remembered, in the 19th century, Irish, Italians, Jews, and Chinese were all considered to be separate races, threatening to pollute the white race. Then, as is often the case now, native-born whites portrayed crime as a problem brought to America by outsiders.
Had the native population of our country been left to the natural and potent influence of these conditions, we should have an unprecedented minimum of crime. Indeed, no one familiar with our criminal returns can fail to see how large a percentage of convicts are of foreign birth or extraction. It is very obvious that such a mass of corrupt and corrupting elements cast into the heart of our population will rapidly diffuse itself throughout the community. Like a foul, turbid stream emptying into a comparatively pure lake, its course can be traced a little way, but is soon indistinguishable from the surrounding waters, which in time it assimilates to its own dark hue. The Pennsylvania Journal of Prison Discipline, 1852.
Not only does immigration bring among us the predatory criminals of all nations, but foreign anarchists openly advocate murder and arson in our slums. Theodore Bingham, Police Commissioner of New York City, 1908.
The first half of the 19th century was a period of escalating tensions over slavery. Philadelphia had a large, free black population, but its proximity to the Mason-Dixon line and its social and economic ties to the South, as well as its status as a major stop on the Underground Railroad, made race relations far more tense than one would suspect from its charitable Quaker heritage.
The peculiar situation of Pennsylvania as a frontier state between the slave and free states, and hence the recipient of a worthless class of colored persons, is the cause of our having so large a portion of colored prisoners. If we add to these the depraved and abandoned persons who infest this large city, it is manifest that we have the most worthless, ignorant, and least profitable inmates of any prison in the Union. Warden Wood, 1840.
During the 19th century, between 20 and 50% of Eastern's American-born inmates were black, a percentage far greater than their proportion in the general population. Eastern's first inmate, Charles Williams, and the first 4 female inmates were black. Masses of immigrants began to compete for their jobs in a rapidly changing labor market. A large number of Irish and German immigrants, fleeing political and economic problems in their own countries, arrived in Philadelphia and settled in the outskirts of the city during the 1840s and 50s. American industrialists actively recruited these populations. Their cheap labor fueled the nation's economic expansion. American-born craftsmen who were losing their livelihoods to industrialization found immigrants and blacks easier to blame for their problems than the structural changes occurring in the American economy. All the major urban centers saw nativist riots directed against the Germans, Irish, Catholics, or blacks during this time. Rioting occurred in the southward Kensington and Manayunk sections of Philadelphia, all areas of early industrialization and poor ethnic ghettos. The riots of 1844 were perhaps the most serious, with at least 30 people killed and 2 Catholic churches and a convent burned. Another wave of immigration occurred between 1880 and 1920. This time the immigrants came mainly from Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. Jews settled in 2 sections of Philadelphia, many finding employment in the garment industry. For their activities in unions, Jews were labeled terrorists and socialists, or for their success in business, viewed as scheming and controlling. Italian immigrants settled in South Philadelphia. Because Italian cultural traditions favored strong extended families and a system of patronage, Italians were assumed to be members of organized crime syndicates like the mafia. While immigrants were often unfairly stereotyped as criminals, some did choose illegal activity as a path to economic advancement. The segregation, dense population, low wages, and substandard housing of ethnic and racial ghettos made those areas breeding grounds for crime. Their inhabitants served as easy scapegoats for all the problems accompanying rapid urbanization and industrialization. After the 1840s, virtually all U.S. prisons adopted Auburn's congregate model of confinement, allowing the state to organize prison labor on an industrial model. Prison officials used convicts for productive and profitable labor that subsidized the cost of the institution. Between the 1840s and the 1860s, most prisons employed their inmates in shops and factories constructed on the prison grounds. Private contractors leased the convicts' labor, supplying the materials and supervision for production in the prison shops. For the next several decades, the officials at Eastern continued to defend the merits of solitary labor. Unfortunately for Eastern, the market for handmade shoes or woven products had disappeared by the 1870s.
The industries formerly pursued have been practically abandoned, first because the concentrated efforts of labor organizations have caused the legislature to pass laws which make the handling of prison-made goods unprofitable. Second, because automatic machinery has been so perfected that the labor of hands is almost dispensed with. Warden Cassidy, 1898.
The prison introduced chair caning, hosiery, and cigar making in the 1880s, and along with the new enterprises and acceptance, at least in practice, of prisoners working together. By the end of the last century, more convicts at Eastern State were idle than employed, and prison officials had to look to other activities to keep their charges occupied. Eastern faced serious overcrowding, as did every prison in America. Officials could not maintain the most fundamental element of its system, separate confinement of prisoners. The situation worsened in the next decade, prompting a major construction project of 4 new cell blocks between 1877 and 1894. Yet by the turn of the century, the number of prisoners increased to 1,400, forcing some cells to hold as many as 4 or even 5 inmates. Concerns about crime and disorder in the lower classes continued to grow during the last decades of the 19th century. Prison leaders from other states openly recognized the failure of both the Pennsylvania and Auburn systems to deal with the problem.
With a rapidly increasing population and the disposition of people to congregate in large cities, we have an alarming increase in crime, and legislation is obliged to be ever devising new remedies and imposing fresh penalties for the protection of society. But prison discipline and the reformation of the convict are still an unsolved problem. It is not enough that we erect great prison houses, grand in conception, beautiful in architectural design and finish, and liberal in their appointments. These are monuments of the prosperity of the state and evidences of the determination of society to protect itself against evildoers. But the granite walls and iron bars, although they deprive the criminal of his liberty and inflict a just physical punishment, do not work that reformation in the soul of the man that will restore him to society regenerated and reformed. Until this is in some measure accomplished, our system of prison discipline is imperfect and ineffectual. Major A.T. Goshorn, chairman of the First National Congress on Penitentiary and Reformatory Discipline, 1870.
New ideas about prisoners and prisons circulated across the nation. This era of reformers called for changes in policy that would have a positive impact on prisoners. The primary inspiration for changing American prisons came from the Irish system, a progressive confinement in which prisoners could work their way through various stages of less restrictive imprisonment, eventually achieving a conditional release or parole. According to these new ideas, prisoners were not, as Enlightenment thinkers had believed, free moral agents needing only rational deterrence and opportunities for reflection. They were flawed individuals, the products of inadequate families and immoral urban influences. They needed not punishment and penitence, but active reformation, guided by the new sciences of human behavior. Although Eastern's wardens scoffed at the new ideas, Eastern State incorporated many of the liberal practices associated with the reformatory movement. As early as 1854, Eastern employed a full-time teacher who visited inmates in their cells, offering tutorials in elementary education, bookkeeping, German, and Spanish. In 1880, policy changes allowed family members to exchange letters with prisoners and to visit at 2 or 3 month intervals. The prison also made an extensive collection of library books available to inmates in their cells. After Warden Cassidy, a staunch defender of the Pennsylvania Plan, died in 1900, Eastern State Penitentiary adopted more of the reformatory practices inspired by the Irish system. Those changes were facilitated by the introduction of a parole system in 1909, which leading scholars viewed as essential to the implementation of scientific criminology. Extensive construction projects created a physical plant better suited to the era's new ideas about inmate reform. In the first 8 years of the new century, using inmate labor, the prison added an industrial building, a shop building, and an emergency hospital for contagious diseases. Existing facilities were improved and repaired. Between 1909 and 1911, the construction of another new cell block added 120 cells for first-time offenders. Eastern set up a literacy program and trade schools. Finally, in 1914, inmates were permitted to congregate for religious services, school classes, and labor. Solitary confinement was now used as a form of punishment or a means of isolating prisoners considered too dangerous or disruptive to be in the general population. 1918 saw the introduction of powered machinery into the shops. Only the radial design of the original cell blocks retained any imprint of Pennsylvania's separate system. That design hampered the prison's transformation. New buildings filled the open spaces between the cell blocks, crowding the 10 acres enclosed by Eastern's high stone walls, but a growing residential community outside the prison prohibited expansion. The early 1920s witnessed serious problems with discipline and security at the prison, due in part to the challenges of supervising a facility poorly suited to congregate activities. Idle prisoners, overcrowded and deteriorating buildings, grew restive and increasingly violent. Prison authorities tried to divert inmates with organized team sports and other recreational activities. But problems mounted, leading to troubles that prompted a major investigation by the grand jury and, following that, the dismissal of the warden, Robert McKenty. The grand jury's report told of widespread drug use, serious breaches in order, and an inmate culture shaped by brutality and extortion. Prison officials had lost control over inmate behavior after Eastern's Board of Inspectors approved a program of inmate self-government, a plan inspired by the goals of the Reformatory movement and implemented successfully elsewhere. At Eastern, the results were disastrous. According to the grand jury's report, the self-appointed inmate committee, known as the Four Horsemen, lost no time in taking control.
The Committee of Four roamed the prison until all hours of the night. Others were out of their cells many hours after the evening lockup. Venereals, tuberculars, psychopaths, and sodomists were released from the quarantine or solitary confinement into which they had been placed. Hold-ups occurred, and certain of the guards were in fear of their lives. Supplemental report of the April Grand Jury, Philadelphia County, May 1923.
The investigation concluded that between 200 and 400 prisoners were addicted to drugs, principally heroin, which was supplied by visitors or corrupt guards and distributed by a network of inmates. They also uncovered 8 whiskey stills, organized high-stakes gambling, and prostitution. The carnival of lawlessness was finally quelled in April 1923, when 50 inmates considered to be at the forefront of the uprising were transferred to other prisons. As was true at prisons around the country, women at Eastern had to fear not just abuse by other convicts, but also rape and violence from the guards employed to watch them. In October 1922, a female inmate at Eastern State swore out a complaint.
One of the keepers came into my cell. I told him to go out, but he said every woman that came in would do what they wanted her to do. So the next day, there was a colored woman and a white woman in the jail who told me that the women would do what the keepers asked them to do. And if you tell on one keeper, everybody would be down on you. So he came in again, and I yelled, and he grabbed me and shook me and told me to turn over, and then unfastened his pants. I told him no. Then he tried to stick his privates in my mouth, having put his hand in back of my head. He stayed there and told me he wanted to use me, and I was afraid, and I consented. He then had sexual intercourse with me. 1 or 2 nights after this, I saw him have intercourse with Annie in her cell next to mine. I talked the matter over with Eveline, the colored woman, and Annie, the white woman, and they told me that I should not say anything about it, that he carried the mail out for us and brought candies and stockings in from the outside. In all, inside of 2 weeks' time, I had intercourse with him 3 times. I wrote a note complaining of this treatment and gave it to a maid named Margaret to hand to the matron. The matron did not come. On the 30th day of July, 1922, I was taken sick on a Sunday morning. The maid came with the matron, and I said, "I'm sick, and this woman you put in with me yesterday jumped over on me." And the warden, who was standing around the corner, before the matron could give me an answer, said, "This is no sanitarium, it is a jail, and I am not the cause of you being here." then they all left me. That night my baby came about dark. It was dead. I picked it up and put it in the next cell, which was the wash house. I stayed in bed about 1 week. I didn't see a doctor nor the matron during that time. About 2 weeks later, the matron came to see me. I then sent for my lawyers to explain this to them, but they did not come. I wrote letters to my half-sister. About 2 months later, my lawyers came to see me and I told them everything. And they said, if the baby was dead, just let it go and don't say anything. About the 14th or 15th, the prison board came to see me at the cell. Ethel Johnson, October 1922.
A few years later, women prisoners were relocated to a separate facility, the State Industrial Home for Women at Muncie. State officials had been calling for the close of Eastern and its replacement with a modern facility since at least 1915. Controversy over where to locate the new prison delayed building for more than a decade. When Graterford Prison for Men finally opened in 1929, 35 miles north of Philadelphia, it took 800 of Eastern's inmates, with more following in the succeeding years. But Eastern did not close. Instead, the less troublesome prisoners who promised a greater chance for reform went to the prison at Graterford, and the now outdated facilities at Eastern, supplemented by yet another new cell block, became a maximum security prison intended for hardcore repeat offenders. The transfers to Graterford eased overcrowding only temporarily.
Something must be done at once. At the rate the prisoners are coming in here now, we have no place to put them unless we hang them on hooks. Warden Smith, 1933.
Overcrowding was only part of the problem. The wardens from the 20s and 30s were known as strict disciplinarians. The first, Warden Groom, replaced many of the guards with military veterans. He built sentry boxes on the corner of the towers, arming them with Krag repeating rifles and Thompson submachine guns. He had iron gates placed at the ends of cell block corridors, moved the warden's office and the visitor's room to the front building, and added an iron gate to the front portal. For punishment, he threw prisoners into the Klondike, a dark and damp, unfurnished cell where men were left unclothed and fed bread and water. His successor, Warden Smith, followed similar policies. Yet, repeated escape attempts, violent outbreaks, hunger strikes, and riots plagued both regimes. The punitive measures of the guards angered convicts and contributed to the violence. Not all the prisoners' complaints in the 20s and 30s concerned violence. They also charged the warden with favoring certain prisoners. Chicago gangster Al Capone was imprisoned at Eastern in 1929 on a weapons charge.
When I was serving my time at Cherry Hill in 1929, the main thing I was sore about was why wasn't I a big shot while I was at it. Here I was doing 8 years for a $197 stick-up and catching all the hell a con gets. And here was Scarface Al Capone in the same pen, living like a king. Former prisoner, 1933.
Escape attempts took several forms. The most dramatic involved digging tunnels. Officials replaced wood planking on cell floors with poured concrete following the discovery of tunnels in the mid-1920s. Excavation for a new central heating system revealed many more abandoned efforts. Warden Smith estimated that 30 tunnels were dug in the late 1930s. The most notorious tunnel escape came in April 1945, involving 22 men, led by Clarence Kleindienst and including Willie Sutton. 10 men never made it out of the prison. Several were recaptured that same day, the remainder within 2 months of the break. The scarcity of employment during the Great Depression limited parole opportunities, increasing crowding in the prison. And though formal policy identified rehabilitation as the institution's primary goal, Warden Smith betrayed his disdain for such ambitions, calling them a joke and saying, "We can't even maintain discipline satisfactorily." In his opinion, 1/3 of the inmates were insane, defectives, or degenerate. Economic troubles in the 30s, followed by the production boom of World War II, attracted many rural Southern blacks to industrial centers in Pennsylvania. Blacks continued to get arrested and convicted at higher rates than whites, in part because of racist law enforcement practices. Before the war, Less than one-third of Eastern's population was black. That percentage rose to more than half in 1948. Within the prison, blacks and whites were segregated until 1960, with the majority of black inmates housed in cells near the kitchen, where they worked, serving other convicts. Pennsylvania's Governor Edward Martin called Eastern State Penitentiary not fit for human habitation in 1944, but the prison remained open and repairs on the dilapidated buildings postponed the inevitable. In 1954, Eastern State Penitentiary was given a new name, the State Correctional Institution at Philadelphia, reflecting the state's commitment to rehabilitative programs in keeping with the turn towards social and psychological counseling favored by professional criminologists. A death row was added in 1956, though prisoners were not executed at Eastern. In 1970, the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia finally closed, its remaining prisoners transferred to Graterford. For a year, the city used the facility to relieve overcrowding at a local jail. Then the site was abandoned, left to decay. Developers proposed turning Eastern into a shopping mall or a gated community. Finally, after much debate, the city permitted the Pennsylvania Prison Society to take over the ruin and manage it as a historic site. When the state transferred Eastern's last prisoners to Graterford, prison officials and scholars still spoke of inmate rehabilitation and reform. Prisoners inspired by the advances other groups had made in the 1960s and early 1970s pressed for and gained recognition of their own civil rights. For a brief time, interest in humane conditions for convicts reemerged as a social issue. However, the dislocations that followed the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, which began in the mid-1970s, worsened the conditions of the nation's poor, creating by the late 1980s an underclass of people excluded from the mainstream economy and isolated in deteriorating inner cities. The programs that had been implemented in the name of rehabilitation and corrections had proved no more successful than had earlier efforts. Prisons still showed little evidence that they either deterred or reformed convicts, nor did they make the streets safer. Fear of crime, especially crime in urban ghettos, continued to rise. Anti-black and anti-immigrant sentiments grew. The public called for longer and harsher sentences for criminals, especially for drug-related offenses that many saw as the cause of other forms of street crime. In 1970, when Eastern closed, 200,000 inmates were doing time in U.S. state and federal prisons. By 1997, the prison population had grown to almost 1.2 million. Today, the U.S. is second only to Russia in the percentage of its population it confines in prison, 5 to 8 times higher than every other industrialized nation. The incarceration rate for American blacks has grown to 6 times that of whites. Americans have never acknowledged the failure of prisons to live up to the humanitarian ideals that inspired their construction, nor have they accepted that prisons do little to control crime. Instead, Americans have expanded the prison system, confining an ever-increasing number of their fellow citizens in institutions that do little more than exact revenge on criminals, not much different than the colonial lash or scaffold. Alexis de Tocqueville's observations of 1833 are still true today. New or recycled justifications for prisons and designs for prison discipline will ensure a steady supply of ever more modern replacements for Eastern.
Nowhere was this system of imprisonment crowned with the hoped-for success. Every year, the legislature of each state voted considerable funds toward the support of the penitentiaries, and the continued return of the same individuals into the prisons proved the inefficiency of the system. However, instead of accusing the theory itself, its execution was attacked. It was believed that the whole evil resulted from a lack of cells and the crowding of prisoners. Alexis de Tocqueville, 1833.